The Colorado winter did not ask permission before it arrived. It came down from the mountains in the last week of November like something that had been waiting all year for its moment. Silent, absolute, and cold enough to turn a man's breath to smoke before it left his lips. By the 1st of December, the ranch sat buried to its fence posts in white, and the only sound that crossed the valley in the morning hours was the wind moving through the pine ridgeline above the house like a low, mournful conversation no one had been invited to join. She had arrived at this ranch 14 months ago as a bride, and in those 14 months she had learned the exact geography of being underestimated. She had learned it in the foreman's eyes the first morning she walked the property line, without asking for an escort. She had learned it in the housekeeper's careful silence whenever she offered a household suggestion that had not been requested. She had learned it in the way the men at the feed store in town spoke to her husband rather than to her, even when the question had been hers, even when the answer needed to land in her hands. And she had learned it, most thoroughly, in the way the town doctor looked at her, always with a particular brand of tolerant patience reserved for decorative things that had begun, unfortunately, to have opinions. Her husband was not a cruel man. He was a proud one, which was a different affliction entirely, and pride in a Colorado rancher had its own climate, cold at altitude, but capable of warmth in the lower elevations if you knew where to stand. She had learned where to stand. She had also learned, in the particular way that a watchful woman learns things, that her husband was not as invulnerable as the valley believed him to be. He had built this ranch from Deer Creek bottom land in sheer refusal. He had negotiated cattle contracts that other men had walked away from cursing. He had ridden through a blizzard the previous January to reach a stranded supply wagon, and he had come home looking half dead, but said nothing about it until the feeling returned to his left hand 3 days later. The town thought him made of granite. She thought him made of something more complicated. A man who had decided, very early, that needing anything was a form of weakness he could not afford. Tonight, that decision was going to cost him. The fever had come on quietly, the way the worst things do. A slight heaviness at dinner, a stillness in his eyes that was not his usual restraint, but something closer to effort. By the time the fire burned low and the house settled into its nighttime silence, his skin was burning hot to the touch, and his breathing had taken on a labored, shallow rhythm that she recognized immediately as dangerous. She sent the ranch hand for the doctor before the clock struck 9, and then she stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the deep, untouched snow resting against the porch rail, and she began to think. She had grown up in the high country of eastern Tennessee, where the summers were green and the winters were merciless, and where her grandmother had kept a small, leather-bound notebook of remedies that no doctor had ever written down. Not because doctors were wrong exactly, but because doctors could not always arrive in time, and nature had a habit of offering what it had without waiting to be asked. Snow was one of those offerings. She had watched her grandmother draw fever down from a child's brow, using cold compresses packed with snow wrapped in linen. Gentle, steady, patient, when the body was burning so fiercely that warmth had become the enemy of survival. The principle was not mystical. It was not folk superstition. It was simply this. When the body climbs past what the body can endure, you give it something colder than the air, and let the temperature find its way back to reason. You do not fight the fever with blankets and prayers and whiskey steam. You meet the fever at its own border, and you negotiate. She understood that. She had always understood things like that. The logic beneath the remedy, the science her grandmother had never named, but had always practiced with the precision of someone who had watched carefully and learned without flinching. She turned from the window. He was lying still against the pillows now, which frightened her more than restlessness would have. Stillness in a man like this one was not rest. It was effort. It was the concentrated labor of a body working too hard at the wrong thing, burning its own reserves to fight a fire that was already inside the walls. She touched his wrist. The pulse was there, steady enough, but too fast, like a horse that had been running long past the point where it should have stopped. She made her decision before she was fully conscious of having made it. That was how her best decisions had always come, not from long deliberation, from recognition. She went to the kitchen and found the large tin basin they used for laundry. She found 2 clean linen sheets, older ones already worn soft, which would hold cold without shocking the skin too sharply. She pulled her wool coat from the hook by the back door, stepped off the porch into the moonlit dark, and began filling the basin with snow from the deep, undisturbed drift pressed against the north wall of the house. The snow that had not been touched by wind or foot traffic, or the warmth rising off the roof. The cleanest snow, the coldest. She carried it inside, set it beside the bed, dipped the first folded sheet into the packed cold, and felt the sharp bite of it through her own hands without flinching. He stirred when she came close, and his eyes opened part way, dark and unfocused, but present enough to know she was there. She pressed the cold linen gently against his forehead, against the back of his neck, against his chest where the fever had made the skin almost painful to touch. She did not ask his permission. She already knew he would have given it. She worked quietly, the way a woman works when she has made up her mind and no longer needs the permission of anyone in the room. The house held a particular silence at that hour. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something waiting. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting amber shapes across the floorboards. The wind pressed against the windows in soft, irregular gusts. And within all of it, he breathed, shallow and too fast, the way a man breathes when his body has turned against itself and has not yet decided which way to fall. She tracked his breathing without looking away from her hands. She had learned that particular attention years ago, the way you learn anything that matters, through necessity, through watching, through refusing to look elsewhere when the thing in front of you demanded your full regard. She changed the compress at his forehead when she felt the cold leave it. She pressed a fresh fold of linen against his throat, where the pulse ran hot and uneven beneath her fingertips. She did not hurry. Speed was not what this required. Steadiness was. Patience. The willingness to sit with a thing that wasn't yet resolved, and not panic at its open edges. He drifted in and out. Once his hand moved, blindly, not quite purposeful, and found her wrist where it rested against the edge of the mattress. He did not grip it. He simply rested his fingers there, as though her presence was a landmark he needed to confirm in the dark. She let him. She did not move her wrist away, and she did not make anything of it. She only changed the compress with her other hand, and let him hold on to whatever small certainty she could offer. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky, she knew without looking, would be that particular shade of deep, clear black that comes after a fresh snowfall settles. Still and enormous, the stars visible all the way to the edge of the world. She had always found comfort in that sky. It asked nothing of her. Around 2 in the morning, he spoke. Not words exactly, more the shape of words, half-formed and roughened by thirst and fever. But she understood what he was trying to ask, and she lifted a cup of water from the nightstand and helped him drink. One careful sip at a time, her hand steady at the back of his neck. His skin still burned, but the burning felt different now. Less wild, less frantic. More like a fire that had found its boundary and begun, slowly, to respect it. She noticed that. She set the cup down, dipped another sheet into the cold basin, and worked on. She did not interpret the change as victory. She did not allow herself that yet. She had seen enough of illness to know that a single quiet hour did not mean the turning had come. But something in her had shifted nonetheless. The particular quality of her watchfulness, moving from braced to careful. She kept her eyes on him, and she kept her hands cold, and she waited for morning. Morning did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, the way honest things often do. A pale gray line at the bottom of the window curtain, so faint she almost missed it. She had been awake the entire night. She knew this not because she had counted the hours, but because the lamp had burned down to its last half-inch of oil, and she had not once considered sleeping. She pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. The heat was still there, but it was a contained heat now. Something with edges. The wild, consuming quality that had frightened her. That deep, furnace core burning that had made her feel as though she were losing him inch by inch through his own skin. That was quieter. Not gone, but quiet. She allowed herself one slow breath. She took it the way a woman takes the first breath after a long climb. Not with celebration, but with the careful recognition that she was still standing. She rose from the chair, her back stiff, her hands cold even now from the hours of damp cloth and cold water, and she crossed to the window. Outside, the ranch yard was still and blue in the early light. The snow she had carried in buckets the night before had long since melted into the floor rugs, leaving only dark rings that would need tending to later. The cold she had brought into this room had done its work and disappeared without asking for any credit. She turned and looked at him. He was sleeping, truly sleeping now, not the terrible half-consciousness of the night, not the restless, dry-lipped turning that had made her pulse spike every time he moved. His breathing was slow. It had rhythm. It had the quality of rest rather than struggle. She did not say anything. There was no one to say it to. But something moved in her chest that she could not quite name. Something between relief and wonder, and a grief she had not known she was carrying until this moment when it began, very slowly, to loosen. She had been afraid. She understood that now, in the stillness of early morning. In a way she had not allowed herself to understand it during the night. She had been afraid not only for him, though she had been afraid for him, deeply and honestly, but afraid of what it meant that she had cared so much. She had not expected to care this much. She had come here as a practical arrangement. She had arrived with her trunk and her terms and her careful, self-preserving distance. She had intended to be useful, not undone. And yet here she was, standing at his window in the gray dawn, with cold hands and an aching back and something unmistakably tender moving through her that she could not attribute to duty or propriety or the simple instinct to keep another living creature from dying. She heard a sound from the bed. She turned. His eyes were open. Not the confused, fever-glazed half-opening of the night. Open and looking at her, with a steadiness that made it clear he had been watching for at least a moment before she turned. She crossed the room slowly, as though moving too quickly might startle something fragile back into hiding. His gaze followed her. Clear, deliberate. Present in a way it had not been for nearly 2 days. She stopped at the edge of the bed and looked down at him without speaking. She was not sure what her face was doing. She hoped it was composed. She suspected it was not. "You're still here," he said. His voice was roughened from fever and disuse, low and careful, like a man testing whether words still worked. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved briefly to the window, where the gray Colorado morning was beginning to pale toward something almost like light. Then back to her. "The snow," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said again. Another silence. This was not the uncomfortable silence of two people with nothing to say to one another. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them had expected to reach, and neither was certain how to proceed. "I remember it," he said. "Parts of it." She said nothing. She waited. "You argued with someone." His brow drew together faintly, the effort of recollection visible. "The doctor. He disagreed with my methods," she said, in a tone that made her precise opinion of his methods perfectly clear, without requiring her to state it. Something moved in his expression then. It was not quite a smile, but it carried the ghost of one, and it made her chest do something she was not prepared to examine. "Did you send him away?" he asked. "I suggested he would be more useful elsewhere," she said, "since he seemed to have exhausted his usefulness here." This time the smile was less of a ghost and more of a presence. Small, worn at the edges, but real. She had not seen him smile before. She found, somewhat inconveniently, that it suited him. "And the household staff," he said. "Did you manage them as efficiently?" "They were cooperative once they understood that I knew what I was doing." He held her gaze. The steadiness in it was still there, the same steadiness she had noticed when she turned and found him watching her. There was something in it beyond wakefulness, something that felt like recognition, as though he were looking at her and seeing, perhaps for the first time since her arrival, not the arrangement, not the practical solution to a practical problem, but the person who had stayed. "You should sleep," she said, because she was not sure what else to do with the weight of that look, and because it was true and sensible and gave her somewhere practical to stand. "You should too," he said quietly. She drew in a breath, nodded once. She turned to retrieve the chair that she had pulled to his bedside in the night, intending to move it back to its proper place by the wall. But when she reached for it, he said her title. Not her name, but her title, the one that marked her as his, in a voice so stripped of formality that it stopped her entirely. She turned back. He had not moved. He lay against the pillows with the careful stillness of a man who had learned, somewhere in the long hours of the night, that stillness cost him less than movement. His color was better, not well, not whole, but no longer the terrible waxen gray that had frightened her more than she had allowed herself to show. His eyes were clear, watching her. "I owe you an accounting," he said. She did not immediately understand what he meant. She stood with her hand still resting on the back of the chair and waited for him to continue. "When you arrived," he said. And the word arrived carried the full weight of what it really meant. The train, the arrangement, the letter she had answered, the life she had stepped into without fully knowing its shape. I had a set of expectations about what the arrangement would require of me and what it would not. She kept her expression even. Most arrangements do. Mine were... He paused. His jaw shifted slightly, the way a man's jaw does when he is choosing honesty over the easier alternative. They were not generous. I had decided before you came that the practical terms would be sufficient, that I would not be required to... Another pause, shorter this time. To look. She understood him perfectly. She wished, for a single moment, that she did not. "I did not look," he said. "Not until last night. Not until I was too weak to look at anything but what was directly in front of me." Something crossed his face. Not shame exactly, but its quieter neighbor. "You were directly in front of me." The room held its silence. Outside, the morning was making itself known in small increments. The sound of boots on the porch below, the distant creak of a gate, the pale, cold light pressing at the curtains with increasing confidence. The world resuming. She took a breath and chose her words the way she chose everything, deliberately. "You are not the first person," she said, "to decide what I was before they knew what I was." He held her gaze and said nothing, which was, she was beginning to understand, one of the more honest things about him. "I did not stay last night because of the arrangement," she continued. The chair was still beneath her hand. She kept it there, the wood solid and smooth. Something real to anchor herself to while she said a true thing out loud. "I stayed because you needed someone who would not be afraid of what needed to be done." "I know," he said. "I want you to know the difference," she said, "between staying because a contract requires it and staying because I chose to." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, and carried something in it that had not been there during any of their prior conversations. Not authority, not instruction, not the careful distance of a man managing an arrangement. It carried asking, "And which was it?" he said. She did not answer right away. That was not evasion. She had spent enough of her life giving quick answers to people who had already decided what they wanted to hear. Answers shaped around other people's comfort rather than her own truth. She had learned to be fast when speed was required and slow when slowness was the more honest choice. This was a moment that deserved slowness. The morning light had moved. It came through the window at a lower angle now, laying itself across the floorboards in long, pale strips, and the room smelled of the pine resin someone had burned in the night to keep the air clean. She noticed these things the way she always noticed things. Not because her mind wandered, but because her mind worked constantly, gathering details the way other women gathered thread, keeping them for when they became useful. "Both," she said at last. He waited. "The contract required me to be present," she said. "It said nothing about snow, nothing about sitting beside you when the doctor had already given up and gone downstairs to wait for a different kind of morning. Nothing about watching the fever in you the way you watch a fire, not to admire it, but to know when it has taken more than it should." She let that settle before she continued. "What the contract required, I gave. What I chose, that was separate, and it was mine to give or withhold. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was still pale, still carrying the translucent quality of a man who had been very close to something and was only now drawing back from it. But his eyes were clear and present in a way they had not been for days. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you would like me to understand the difference." "I am telling you," she said, "that the difference exists whether you understand it or not. I would prefer you understood it, but I did not do what I did in order to be understood. I did it because it was right." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly. It was a more complex movement than that. The way a landscape changes when the cloud cover breaks not all at once, but in pieces, light arriving in sections, slowly revealing what was always there beneath. "I have managed this ranch," he said, choosing his words with the same deliberateness she had used, "by knowing what things are worth, by reading them correctly." A pause. "I did not read you correctly." "No," she agreed, "you did not. I would like to." She looked at him. The chair was still beneath her hand. The light was still moving across the floor. Outside, she could hear the sound of boots on the porch steps, the household returning to its ordinary rhythms now that crisis had passed, and the world believed everything was resolved. But something in this room was not resolved. Something in this room was only just beginning, and both of them knew it, and neither of them yet knew what to do with that knowledge. "Then ask better questions," she said. He asked better questions. Not that day. That day he slept again by mid-morning, the body's long debt collecting itself in stages, pulling him back under before he had fully arrived at the surface. But in the days that followed, as the color returned to his face and the household settled back into its ordinary creaking rhythms, he began to ask. He asked how she had known about the snow. She told him. Her grandmother's method, learned in a different country, in a different climate entirely, where fevers came in summer and the mountain streams ran cold enough to stop them. Not a doctor's knowledge, a woman's knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next, in the way such things were passed, not in books, not in lecture halls, but in the language of hands and observation and trust. He listened without interrupting. That was not a small thing. He asked what she had thought, in those hours when the fever had been at its highest, when the outcome was uncertain in every direction. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "I thought," she said, "that I would not let fear make the decision for me." He turned that over as if it were a coin he hadn't seen before, examining the weight of it. He asked, more carefully, what she had expected when she came here, what she had understood the arrangement to be, and here she chose honesty over comfort, because she had learned that comfort built on softness eventually collapsed, and she had no interest in building anything that would not hold. "I expected a contract," she said. "Terms, a structure I could work within. I did not expect—" She paused, finding the word. "I did not expect to care whether the structure stood or fell." The room was quiet after that. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a considered one, the kind that forms around a sentence that has told the truth and is waiting for the truth to be received. Outside, the snow was beginning to soften at the edges. The eaves dripped in a slow, irregular rhythm. Somewhere across the yard, one of the hands was moving timber. the sound carrying clean and distant through the cold air. He looked at his hands, which were still thinner than they had been, still carrying the faint evidence of what his body had endured. "You could have left," he said. Not an accusation, an observation precisely placed. "Yes," she said, "but you stayed." "I stayed." He did not ask why. Perhaps he already suspected. Perhaps he was not yet ready to hold the answer. Or perhaps he understood, in the way that certain people understand certain things, without requiring them to be spoken aloud, that some truths arrive in their own time and cannot be hurried without being damaged. What he said instead was quieter than anything he had said before. "I'm glad you did." The dripping from the eaves continued. The light moved across the floor. She did not yet answer. She let the silence breathe a little longer before she answered him. Not because she was uncertain. She had been certain for some time now, longer perhaps than she had admitted to herself. But certainty and readiness are not always the same thing, and she had learned in her life that words spoken too quickly in fragile moments have a way of landing wrong, even when they are true. So she gave the moment what it required, which was a few more seconds of honest quiet, and then she said, "I stayed because I chose to." It was a simple sentence. It was also, in its way, a complete one. He looked at her, not with the careful, measuring look he had used in those early weeks when she had felt like something being appraised for its usefulness, but with something different. Something that had come into him slowly, the way warmth comes back into a hand that has been a long time in the cold. Not all at once, not without some aching, but genuinely. "You chose to," he repeated, as though he were testing the weight of it, as though the idea of being chosen, not contracted, not inherited, not merely accepted, was something his mind needed to hold carefully before it could trust it. She folded her hands in her lap. Outside, the dripping from the eaves had steadied into something more rhythmic. The light in the room had the pale, clean quality of late winter afternoon, the kind that carries no warmth but has a particular honesty to it, as if it illuminates things precisely as they are, without any flattering softness. "The doctor thought I was wrong," she said, not bitterly, plainly. The doctor was frightened. He was, she agreed. Frightened men give very loud opinions. Something moved in his expression then. Not quite a smile. He was not yet entirely a man who smiled easily, and she did not expect him to become one overnight. But the suggestion of one, the beginning of the architecture of it. "And you were not frightened?" he asked. She considered this honestly, because it deserved honesty. "I was frightened," she said. "I simply decided that being frightened was not a reason to do nothing." He was quiet again. The timer of timber across the yard had stopped. The house had settled into one of its late afternoon silences, which she had come to recognize as its own kind of presence. Not emptiness, but the texture of a place that was learning how to hold two people instead of one. He looked toward the window. The snow on the sill had softened at the edges just slightly, just beginning the long work of becoming water again. "I was wrong," he said, "about a great many things." He said it to the window, and then he said it to her, which was different. The second time was the one that counted. She did not tell him it was all right, because it was not entirely all right yet. But it was beginning to be. The days that followed were quiet in the way that convalescence always is. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, as though the ranch itself had agreed to hold its breath while something mended. He was not a patient man by nature. She had gathered that much. The ranch hands moved around him with the particular caution of men who had learned through experience that his temper was short when he was idle. But she found that if she brought him something useful, a ledger that needed review, a letter that required answering, he softened into a kind of temporary cooperation. He was not ill enough to be helpless and not yet well enough to be fully himself. And in that in-between territory, something honest was possible between them. She brought him tea he did not ask for. He drank it without complaint. She brought him a book she had found on the shelf in the front room, a history of the Colorado Territory, and he looked at it for a long moment before looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "You've been through the library," he said. "I have," she said, unashamed. "You have a good one." He said nothing, but he opened the book. The doctor came once more before the week was out, climbed the stairs with the air of a man prepared to find evidence that he had been right all along, and found instead a patient whose fever had been gone for 4 days, and who was sitting up in bed reviewing a contract for winter hay delivery. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The doctor left shortly after, with considerably less ceremony than he had arrived with on any of his previous visits. When spring came, and it did come, the way spring always comes to high country, slowly and then all at once, she stood on the front porch in the early morning light and watched the snow retreat from the meadow, like a tide pulling back from shore. He came and stood beside her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cold air. "I would like," he said carefully, as though he was choosing each word by weight, "to begin again, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The man she had arrived to marry and the man standing beside her were not the same man. The distance between them had been made by something that mattered, not illness alone, but the particular grace of being seen clearly in a moment of helplessness and not being abandoned. "I am willing," she said. The meadow stretched out before them, wide and cold and beginning, in all its patient silence, to turn green. She had come west expecting very little. She had found something she had not known to want. A man who had learned, through snow and fever and the plain courage of one steady woman, that respect was not a concession. It was a beginning.